Hello and welcome to yet another rendition of Rolling in Mills, though I'm not even sure if I should call it that anymore. This is basically going to be a new format that I am trying / I have been playing with already, where basically I'm going to be looking over the various Criterion releases per month. So for example, this month I'll be looking at October of the year of our Lord 2016, basically looking over each of the individual films relatively briefly and kind of gauging how worthy they are of a restoration of the Criterion treatment, what sort of treatment they're getting, like what sort of extras they have, the actual quality of the films themselves, and then other random points kind of spawning from that. But the biggest point of this video is that it works a little bit like the menu of a DVD. That's a bit of an outdated reference, I suppose. The menu of a Blu-ray, I guess, is kind of fitting for Criterion stuff. Basically, I'll be giving a little brief overview of each film with a particular focus on the Criterion release aspect of it. But then you'll be able to also click an annotation that leads to a full kind of talking head video review of each film that I've already made prior to this. So basically, this video serves kind of like a synopsis for the films with a focus on the Criterion stuff, and then the video reviews are like a full coverage of my thoughts on each one of the films. Ultimately, I'm kind of gauging what I'd want to be buying in like a 50% off sale, and which other releases this month I consider a waste of money or a waste of your time. Basically, for this video, I'll just be kind of judging what sort of films I'm looking at to buy in the future, for example, at like a 50% off sale, and then which ones I would consider a waste of money, or films just not really worth checking out. And with that being said, let's just get straight into it. First film is McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is the 1971 dream western from American director Robert Altman. This is just another really solid film from Altman, and it kind of fits in with other classics like Nashville and Three Women, which are also in the collection and I would highly recommend checking out. This film has a really solid history to it as well. Like with some other classics, it was asked to be preserved in the United States National Film Registry, as well as it appearing on many top 10 lists for the best westerns ever created. In saying that, however, this does not function like a normal western. In fact, Altman even calls it an anti-western, due to it basically undermining many of the conventions of that genre in an absolutely spectacular fashion. Furthermore, this is one of the most panoramic and stunningly visual films I've ever seen, which makes me very excited for the 4K digital restoration that this is getting. And that's especially pertinent considering that the only copy existing of this film is really grainy, and while it does kind of contribute to that dreamy comfort of the film, it is definitely in need of some cleaning up. Also, just in terms of the packaging, I really like the cover for this film, and I'm not really sure why, but I just really like it. I think it kind of captures the general comfy vibe of the film, seeing McCabe wrapped in those absurdly large furs, but I don't know, I just like it. Anyway, in terms of scoring this film, this is an 84 out of 100 for me, and I think it'll be a fantastic addition to the collection. It's a culturally important, genre-defining, and defying film, and one in much need of a restoration. It also comes with a making-of documentary, audio commentary from Robert Altman, archival interviews with cinematographer Vilmos Zsigmond, and I'm 100% that name is said incorrectly. It's also a gallery of production stills and an essay by Nathaniel Rich. And I think the making of documentary extras and the production stills will be especially interesting considering how visually focused this film is, as well as the actual making of it being very interesting. Kind of famously, the extras on set for the 3-month shooting time were basically allowed to live out the lives of their characters and kind of create who they would be in this 18th century setting. All around, it's just a really solid package. The full review of this film can be found here on this link, or if you don't want to stop this video for that, then it'll just be in the description. Same applies for the rest of the films that I'll be talking about. And speaking of Robert Altman, another one of his films has actually made it into the collection this month, or should I say has remade its way into the collection. Shortcuts, the 1993 film, briefly revitalized Altman's career alongside, in my mind, the superior film The Player, which was released to the collection earlier this year as well, and also stars Tim Robbins. This new release is a 4K upgrade from the Criterion DVD copy of this film, which kind of baffles me considering that this film is generally quite dull visually, fitting into that horrid and really jarring 90s color scheme. I understand restoring a film like Teshigahara's Woman in the Dunes to Blu-ray, because a DVD of that just beautiful film does not do it justice in the slightest. Also on that note, when is there going to be a Face of Another Blu-ray? Please. But here with Shortcuts, you're just kind of polishing a turd to 4,000 pixels. And that's not to say that the film is a turd, it's just that the shitty visuals, no pun intended, do not really necessitate a 4K release in my opinion, especially considering how limited the amount of Criterion releases there are per month. This release also comes with the standard essay, restored audio, conversation between Altman and Tim Robbins, and a full, behind-the-scenes, feature-length documentary of the making of this film, as well as some deleted scenes. The cover art is decent, but nothing incredible in my mind. As an actual piece of filmmaking, it's okay, but for me, at this point, it's kind of lost its charm a little bit. Though it does have some really oddball names with it as well, like Tom Waits and Huey Lewis of all people. In my mind, the main benefit of this film's creation is that it would later go on to influence Paul Thomas Anderson's films Boogie Nights and Magnolia, which are far superior in my opinion. Straight up, this is my least favorite Altman that I've seen so far. I actually feel like the vast cast of characters here actually works to this film's disadvantage, because it creates this really convoluted plot rather than a complex one, and a bunch of half-baked and weak character arcs rather than just a few really strong ones. Also, everything I mentioned there that this film fails at, like the weak characters, visuals, and plot, Paul Thomas Anderson basically strives through in Boogie Nights and Magnolia. Overall, this is a 74 out of 100 for me, which is obviously by no means terrible, but I'm just mainly disappointed that this film, out of the many DVD releases that could have been bumped up to 4K, was chosen instead. It's obviously worth a watch if you're a fan of Altman, and even if you aren't, but honestly, there's a far superior Altman film coming out this very same month, not to mention the other brilliant pieces already in the collection like Nashville and Three Women. Richard Linklater's 24 film Boyhood was an extremely divisive one upon release. Basically follows the story of a boy's boyhood, incredibly shooting across 12 years of production, leading many people to call it an epic and one of the better films of the millennium. Some absolutely loved it, obviously, and praised its unique and groundbreaking 12-year production, while others hated it, claiming it was boring, contained nothing of value, and relied only on its gimmick for support. I kind of fall in the middle of these camps because I just find the film painfully average. While the gimmick has this really cool effect in that you can see people aging before your eyes, I feel like they didn't actually take the most of it, and in that process also disregard some absolute fundamentals of screenwriting that were not replaced with anything meaningful in their absence. In saying that, however, not only do I think this film is not particularly good as a work of art, but I don't really think it deserves a spot in the collection. I mean, does this film need to be restored or bumped up to 2K? I would argue not really. It looks fine as it is, and the Blu-ray copy I've seen of it is perfectly fine. Plus, it's not really visually driven enough to necessitate this. In that case, is it culturally significant? Well, in my mind, you can't really judge a 2-year-old film for its significance. I'd say give it 10 to 20 years and you'll probably have a better scope of how good it is. And then of course the other major component is that it should be added to the collection because of its groundbreaking techniques. But in that case, why don't you just add the Up series, which has been shooting across 50 plus years with the same cast of people. And if you're going to make the argument for gimmicks in film, then why don't you just add any film that has a really crazy special gimmick to it? I don't think having one thing in a film, e.g. a gimmick, no matter really how good it is, should define it as something that really deserves a spot in the collection. The only thing I really like about this release is the cover art. It really brings together the photography career of its main character, Mason, and shows off the aging gimmick in the process. It's a really nice, clean cover. I dig it. In my mind, this is a bit of a money grab from Criterion so that they can sell the equivalent of a collector's edition for those enamored by the film, because as far as I'm aware, it was quite popular with some mainstream audiences. However, if that's what it takes to give us the other fantastic stuff that they do, then I am totally fine to take that hit. But I would 100% have preferred another film to be given this treatment. This is a 55 out of 100 for me. However, I know a lot of people really enjoyed this film and I can't take that away from them, so it's a nice but very expensive for what you're getting bump up in quality. But honestly, you're just better off buying the Blu-ray release. Honestly, the extras here are probably going to be the most interesting part of the film, considering its audio commentary from the full cast and a behind-the-scenes documentary looking at the 12-year shoot. But even so, I think you kind of know what you're getting with that before you see the film. Plus, most of that's kind of common knowledge anyway, considering it was the big marketing push and, of course, gimmick of this film. Pan's Labyrinth, the 2006 film from famed Spanish director Guillermo del Toro, is a welcome contemporary addition to the collection. It's one of the better popular foreign films of the Ooze, telling a dark, gothic fantasy tale in the setting of post-Spanish Civil War. Famously, this is a quasi-remake of del Toro's previous, and in my mind, quite inferior film The Devil's Backbone. The incredible visual design lends itself to basically all aspects of this film, be it set design, costuming, lighting, blocking, whatever, which makes the 2K restoration even better. Unlike McCabe and Mrs. Miller though, the highest quality existing copy of this film is decent, but of course a 2K bump up is definitely welcomed. There's also some great extras here, like interviews and an audio commentary from Del Toro, a bunch of making of documentaries looking at the special effects and makeup in the film, as well as animated comics for some of the film's mythical creatures, which I think is really cool. These behind the scene extras should be especially interesting considering how much of a technical marvel this film is for costume and set design. And as the icing on the cake, it has subtitles written and approved by Del Toro himself, which is actually the result of his previous film The Devil's Backbone being poorly subbed by Spanish translators. Also, I just love the cover art on this one. I think the wonderfully gothic design and art style really just fits the tone of this film and incorporates the really important visual element of the fawn's head, as well as one of the many yonic entrances in the film. Ultimately, Pan's Labyrinth is a wonderful semi-coming-of-age piece with some beautiful visual design and stunning performances, making it an 84 out of 100 for me. And speaking of Del Toro, this month also includes a release titled Trilogia de Guillermo del Toro, which also includes Cronos, Del Toro's debut film, as well as The Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth. However, I do have a couple of issues with this release. For one, Cronos and The Devil's Backbone are already available on Criterion, which kind of stuffs over people who had bought either one or both of those films, and means that buying this comparatively cheaper box set is kind of out of the option for them. Secondly, Pan's Labyrinth is really the only strong draw here out of the trilogy, especially considering that this is an informal trilogy of films, and not particularly amazing ones either. Even if a film trilogy as a whole isn't amazing, like in the case of the Qatsi trilogy, in which Koyaanisqatsi is the only real standout, it makes sense for them to be collected and bought as a trio. I mean, having an informal trilogy can be fine, like the 3 films of Teshigahara, but honestly, Cronos and The Devil's Backbone aren't good enough to justify this trilogy, let alone the $80 price tag. While The Devil's Backbone is decent, Pan's Labyrinth is essentially the same film with every element kicked up about 5 notches. Cronos, on the other hand, while significant as Del Toro's debut film, suffers from really strange pacing and is very rough around the edges generally, and in my opinion not really worth buying or watching. You know, if Criterion calls the film an auspicious, audacious feature debut and a highly unorthodox tale, then it's just code for you tried. It's like how they call that sulfur-huffing holocaust that is Jellyfish Eyes a film that takes boundless imagination to the screen, boasts unforgettable creature designs, and is pointedly, yes, pointedly set in a post-Fukushima world. However, the cover art for Cronos is really neat, same with The Devil's Backbone, I just absolutely love the design of that. Plus, it wonderfully sits as spine number 666. Unless you love Del Toro unconditionally, or you can get this really cheap, I would definitely not recommend buying this. Even with 50% off in a Barnes & Noble sale, I would still hesitate on this one. I mean, there are just so many better trilogies to go with, like Pasolini's Trilogy of Life, Rossellini's War Trilogy, or the Three Colors Trilogy, all of which are also far more important to cinema as a whole. The Executioner is a 1963 Spanish film from director Luis Garcia Belanger. It is a masterpiece of black humor, beloved in Spain but too little seen anywhere else. Okay, I gotta come clean here, and this is kind of awkward, but I literally could not find a single copy of this film, and I mean could not find anywhere. I mean, there aren't any online, and I checked various locations. I checked several film libraries across various universities, and they didn't have it. I checked various illegal websites for this, including private trackers, and I still couldn't find it. Though to be fair, I'm not on Pass the Popcorn or anything elusive like that, unless someone wants to hit me up with an invite, eh? So I guess my search for this apparent long-lost treasure is kind of a good sign of it getting a re-release. And in saying that, I even saw a thread on IMDb claiming that this was borderline impossible to find in Spain, let alone the rest of the world. And apparently it could only be obtained through something as ridiculous as like a magazine coupon offer, though I found no other evidence of that actually being true. To make up for this, I tried to watch this guy's other films, but yeah, they also aren't really around either. So yeah, that's where I'm at right now. Kind of hard to review and recommend something I haven't seen though. So yeah, this is obviously just a question mark out of 100 for me. Obviously I can't rate or judge something I haven't seen in the same way I can't recommend it or claim it's good or bad or whatever for the collection. To make up for this, however, I'm going to buy this film on Blu-ray and do a review of it at a later date. I will say though that this is the first film in a very long time that I have been completely unable to get a hold of, which is obviously terrible timing for this video. The Tree of Wooden Clogs is apparently a Bergman-esque Italian film from 1978 by director Ermanno Olmi. Now I first discovered this film, strangely enough, under the Vatican's list of 45 great films, sitting under the category of values, which is not really surprising at all considering that this film has some pretty heavy Christian overtones. However, like other Christian masterpieces like Odette or Andrei Rublev, it doesn't hammer you over the head with any of its messages and instead functions completely on its own as a work of art. Now I mentioned Tarkovsky before due to the deliberately slow and naturalistic pace, which is not surprising considering that the Italians helped to formalize this style with the neo-realist movement. But it's also a strange coincidence considering that Tarkovsky's last two features were shot in Italy due to him living there after defecting from Russia. In particular, the focus on nature and just letting the camera sit there for these beautiful shots reminds me quite heavily of Tarkovsky's film Nostalgia, which I would highly recommend to anyone. And then the plot of these like dilapidated, poor farmers really struggling to get by kind of reminds me a bit of Tar's Southern Tango, though little else besides like the basic plot elements. While I really like this film, it does come with quite a heavy disclaimer in that it is definitely not for anyone. And one of the reasons is because I know that it will simply bore some people to absolute death. The 3-hour runtime can really feel its length at times, especially for me. The first hour and a half I kind of struggled with before I really became engrossed in it, but obviously that'll change from person to person. In saying that, some people will obviously find this as beautiful and wonderful as I did, but I just know that some people will really struggle with it, and it is a very specific pick. Also, due to this being a period piece and trying to depict life as naturally as possible, there are 2 scenes that involve the real-life killing of animals, one in which a pig is executed, bled out, which basically means its blood is collected in a tin can, and then it is gutted fully on screen, and all of this is shown. I'm not really bothered by this at all, and I've seen real life footage of this kind of thing anyway, but I know obviously that some people would kind of be offended by that or wouldn't want to see that, so obviously take that into consideration as well. I also agree that this is just generally a really great pick for the collection for multiple reasons. One, it has significance to film due to it winning the Palme d'Or, which has to count for something obviously. 2, it's an underrated classic in many people's minds, and the only reason I had actually heard of this film prior to the Criterion version is because a friend of mine showed me that Vatican list, which I would highly, and I mean this unironically, highly recommend checking out. They've actually got some seriously fantastic recommendations on there. 3rd, while not in dire need of a restoration unlike McCabe and Mrs. Miller, the entire time I was watching the film I was just envisioning that like A Brighter Summer Day cleanup video that Criterion released, which shows them restoring that film just incredibly from its awful Laserdisc edition. And so when I was watching this, I could just tell it would look amazing in 4K. It's just got that type of film grain, that 70s film grain there's just something about the colors that is so beautiful. It almost looks washed out, which is generally a negative, but there's something about it that just feels so natural, which is of course also complemented by a lot of the natural imagery in the film. There aren't a huge amount of extras on this release besides the usual essay and 2 interviews with the director Olmi, but I mean these should be sufficient in enlightening a little known film like this one is. Overall, this is an 86 out of 100 for me. And that's it for the coverage of the films this month, so now it's time for the cutting block. What film would I personally buy if I could only choose to buy one? Well, despite the Tree of Wooden Clogs getting a higher score, I would have to go with McCabe and Mrs. Miller. While I don't like to shy away from hard and difficult film experiences, I can see myself watching McCabe and Mrs. Miller again and again and again, which I would of course consider a benefit if I'm going to own the film physically. In saying that, it's really neck and neck, and for a first time watcher, I would probably recommend The Tree of Wooden Clogs because it's just a fantastic film. But the issue with that, like I said previously, is that it's also a very specific recommendation, and I know lots of people just would not like the film at all. Now, the reason I didn't choose Pan's Labyrinth, despite that having the same score as McCabe and Mrs. Miller, is mainly that a really decent copy of the film already exists that I've seen, plus it already has a bunch of really good extras on it. And for me, while McCabe is just a slightly better film in my opinion, the only existing copy is a far inferior product to what what a 4K one would be. So what is the worst addition to this month? Well, the clear-cut contender for me is just Boyhood. I mean, it just seems so unnecessary, and while being a really average film in my mind, it just doesn't really lend itself in any way to what Criterion is about. I mean, sure, it did something new and kind of groundbreaking in terms of shooting across 12 years, but I mean, tons of films have really interesting gimmicks, and many of them actually take full advantage of those. Plus, if you want to watch another series of films which are also, funnily enough, by Linklater, then why not just release the Before trilogy on Criterion, which I would consider a far superior piece as a whole. Plus, you also get to see Ethan Hawke age just like in Boyhood, but he's actually a nuanced and compelling character in those films. The trilogy of Del Toro's films wins the best cover art, though considering Kronos and Devil's Backbone were already on Criterion, the award has to go to Pan's Labyrinth. Overall, I would give a hearty recommendation to McCabe and Mrs. Miller and Pan's Labyrinth, a specific but strong recommendation for The Tree of Wooden Clogs, a Luke/borderline warm mention to Shortcuts, and a no-no to Boyhood and the trilogy of Del Toro films. Now, as a special little random ending segment, I'm just going to pick one film per month that I would like to see on the collection, or that I think would kind of fit very, very well into the collection. Now, for the most part, I'm going to try to make these at least semi-plausible picks, and not call for something that has a really recent and fantastic release, or a film that would just be absolutely impossible to get the rights to, like something like Citizen Kane or Psycho or something. My pick for the month is Mikhail Klatozov's 1964 film Soy Cuba, also known as I Am Cuba. Now, I've previously done a review of Klatozov's Letter Never Sent, which I also love and has a fantastic Criterion release that I would highly, highly recommend watching. I think that film is very, very underrated, even among people who like the film. But in my mind, Soy Cuba is just on another level. It is visually and technically one of the most groundbreaking and mind-blowing films I've seen. There are some shots in there where I just don't know how they've done them in the slightest. I mean, it would be stuff that would be difficult to do now even with CGI. But this is from 1964. How do you do some of the shots in this film? Just mad. Especially, and if you've seen the film, I'm referring to the cigar shot. Please, someone tell me how they did that. The crane work in that film is just bonkers. How? Now, funnily enough, Martin Scorsese actually pushed for a DVD restoration of this film, which ended up happening, and while it's decent, it is kind of outdated, and I feel like a 4K rendition of something that is so beautiful as a film really could do it justice. Plus, like all Soviet-made films, it has some really, really interesting backstory to it, including the fact that it was basically hated by the Russians at the time of its release, and was almost completely lost until the early 1990s. Ultimately, I think it would really serve to highlight this really underrated Russian director who already has a film on Criterion anyway, and it would give some much needed exposure to it. And that's it. Obviously, this is my first time doing this kind of thing, so I would love some feedback on it. Obviously came to a bit of a bump in the road with the whole executioner thing not happening, and at the time of recording the Tree of Wooden Clogs review, which was some time ago, I just haven't gotten around to editing that yet. I've been very busy. It was still coming out in October, but unfortunately, it's been, and quite recently I think, been pushed back to February 2017, which is just crazy. That's like 4 months, so I'm not really sure what happened with that, but obviously I'm just including that in this video anyway, because I've already done a review of it. I'd highly recommend, if you want to see some other Criterion stuff, checking out these videos from this guy called Magnus Prophecy, the first one of which is just an overview of the Criterion collection. It's just a great introduction to the series, and it's just a really solid video. The second is a video review that I collaborated with him on, where we discuss the Criterion release of Hausu, which is just, I mean, if you haven't seen Hausu, then I mean, what are you doing with your life? It's one of my favorite films, one of the most insane, abstract, surreal pieces of work. I mean, it's just, you have to see it to believe it, basically. It's the most house film I've ever seen. So I would highly recommend checking that video out. He did a great job editing it, and I did a terrible job narrating it. I sound like I want to fucking neck myself half the time. Obviously, if you missed any of the reviews I was talking about, you can just check them out in the description if you want links to them. And yeah, au revoir.